Vintners spring weekend. We've been dying for rain and praying for rain, and of course it came on one of the biggest celebrations we have during the year. But thank you for coming. We are really pleased to host this morning's seminar. Our board of directors spends a fair amount of time talking about themes and how we want to make the seminars interesting and different. And someone mentioned, oh, there's an article in Edible magazine, and we have 30 copies, so I know there's 50 of you, or close to 50. 2 years ago, an article was written in Edible Santa Barbara about Zaca Mesa University, and it was a profile of all these great winemakers that had, at one point or another, worked for Zaca Mesa. And it's a tremendous article. We have 30 copies. If you would like a souvenir to take home, just as you depart, hopefully no one has to fight. So if you're a couple, maybe one per couple. So we were thrilled to have Ken Brown, Jim Clendenen, Bob Lindquist, Eric Mohseni. I'm not going to go into their bios. That's why we have an amazing moderator. We're really honored to have Chris Sawyer moderate the panel. I met Chris a year and a half ago. He'll tell you about his new project, but we spent the day tasting and touring around. He's a dynamic wine personality. And when we came up with the theme, there was no better person than Chris to lead it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chris Sawyer. Have a wonderful seminar. For those of you who are going on to the festival, it's rain or shine. I come from the East Coast where it's monsoon. This is just like Seattle drizzle. This makes wine more fun. There is tenting. It looks by 2 o'clock the rain subsides, but it's going to be a wonderful day. Tomorrow, a lot of wineries are having open houses, so we encourage you to head out into wine country, into Los Olivos, all the towns to have continue your wine tasting experience. So with that.
Oh yeah, all right. Well, welcome everyone. It's really an honor to be here today. My career as a sommelier and a wine writer actually started at the University of California, Davis. That's where I went to school. I was actually the music guy. Wrote all the music reviews on all the hip bands in the early 90s and started getting assigned to do some stories on the viticulture and enology program there, which turned out, and I did not know this at the time, that it was like the best in the whole nation and one of the best in the world. And I took an elective class and started to learn some cool things. And I remember one of our tasting sessions was about Santa Barbara County. Ooh, what's this all about? And 9 classes later, I was kind of at that point where it's, do I become a winemaker or what do I do? But I had already got 2 degrees in other things, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to go back to Sonoma County where I was born and raised and write about wine. And that got me into the industry back in the 90s, in the mid-90s. And so from a really interesting perspective, I've followed these gentlemen up here in Zaca Mesa since the mid-90s. And I really am proud to be able to say that, and that we've been friends for a long time, all of us. And that's why when I read that article in Santa Barbara Edible, I was just blown away by it, because it's such an interesting story about Zaca Mesa Winery that a lot of people just do not know this story. And today you're going to find out a lot more about that and the characters that were involved, obviously, in this. But to begin with, I just want to say, Ken Brown's right here. He's to my left. He's going to be second speaker, because Ken has when he was hired by Zaca Mesa, he was really the first real winemaker there, and he started hiring these 2 gentlemen next to him, Jim Clendenen and Bob Lindquist. And Eric came along back when I was writing with WineX magazine, back in the crazy days of the 2001, when he was a little assistant winemaker, and then he became the winemaker in 2007. And so it's just been so fascinating to follow everyone. And so a couple years ago when I came here, the reason for that journey, and it was kind of fun because Morgan had just become the executive director of the Vintners Association here. And so she was going to some of these wineries for the first time with me, and I felt like I I'm kind of her guide here. And we got to talk to a lot of these people. And it was for an article I wrote on Santa Ynez appellation. And it's part of my book, which will be out next year. And it's a very interesting thing, and it's a phenomenon that we should all be proud of. 1983 was such a significant year in the wine industry that no one knows enough about. 1983 was when 19 appellations were made on the West Coast. So when we talk about appellations, we're talking about government-approved growing zones. We call them American viticultural areas that are very significant. 1983 was the year that Santa Ynez appellation was made. 2 years before that was Santa Maria. Santa Maria was the the third appellation made on the West Coast. That's how cool this area is. At the time that we're talking about here, we're not really talking about that much growing here. What we see today, and we go down the roads and we see these wineries everywhere, and there's all these new winemakers who we haven't seen before, and it's just kind of hip. It wasn't like that back in the 70s, and especially even back in the 60s. So the first grapes were planted here of to really make the significant change was 1964, and it was really the Nielsen vineyard that was planted that year, and Ken would go on to later work with that vineyard quite a bit and extensively, and it really became a very important thing here. And that was actually the same year, 1964, that Bob and his family moved to the West Coast. So it was almost like destiny was being sealed for him when those grapes were being put in the ground, that he would actually come here from Southern California. If you don't know Bob Lindquist, it's surprising that he is not wearing his Dodgers jacket right now, because he bleeds Dodger blue. There's no doubt about that. This man, and there's a great story too between Jim and Bob, how Jim kind of saved his ass at one point, and it's a kind of a cool story. Hopefully these guys will tell that story of how Bob actually ended up working at Zaca Mesa. It was a really cool story, and it shows a friendship that has lasted forever, and after Ken had hired them. So 1964 was when those first grapes were put in. What really changed Santa Barbara County after that was the early 70s, and it really came down to 1971 being a very important year, because that's when Richard Sanford put in that amazing vineyard, him and the Sanford and Benedict vineyard, Mr. Benedict as well, and we're going to talk about that wine. That's going to be the second wine that you're going to be tasting. And as we go along in talking, you can have sips and kind of start getting to know these wines. After each one of these great personalities tells a little story about what got them into wine and the Zaca Mesa tales and what took them to the next level. Then we're going to be going more into the wines about each one and why they decided to bring this wine. But 1971 was when that Sanford and Benedict vineyard was really planted. And it wasn't until 1976 that wine came out into the market, the Pinot Noir, that really got people looking at this area as being potential. And prior to that, 1972 was really when the first part of the plantings at Zaca Mesa were happening. And so you have this little threshold that was starting to build right then. The same time that the Endocito was being planted, and that's that great vineyard we're going to be talking about with Bob and Jim, for that matter, because that's where their winery is based, is right at the base of the mountain where the vineyards are planted. And when they came together in 1989, that's when it's part of their home now, and it's a really interesting excursion there. So in 1972, when the Miller family started putting in the Endocito, it was a big deal. And at the time, as we went through the 70s, people started coming here. Big parts of land were starting to be bought. The Firestone family was already here on Fox and Canyon Road. And you have all this good energy going. But where were the grapes going? There were not that many brands at the time that were really making these hot wines that we taste today. There's actually a lot of wineries from the north were actually buying the fruit. They got it. They understood that this was a place here where we can source fruit from there because no one knows enough stuff about Santa Barbara County yet. That started to change in the 80s, and it's kind of one of those things where these first three gentlemen here started to kind of go in their own direction right there in the 80s. So Ken went on to found Byron Winery originally, and then Jim and Adam Tomac, who was also on the staff of the original kind of shift of the first decade of Zaca Mesa. Adam and Jim started Morgen Climat, and the whole idea of kind of doing something other than where we're working. Today, it is so trendy for winemakers and assistant winemakers to have little brands on the side. These guys were setting the bar for that to happen. This was not something that was happening all over the place. Today, everyone's making wine. Seems like every assistant winemaker has his own label, or her own label, for that matter.
And every sommelier.
And every sommelier, yeah, that's for sure. You know, it's an interesting thing. I've been a sommelier for 20 years, and it's interesting how many young sommeliers there are today. It's a great thing. Anyone see the movie Somm? Yeah, pretty good movie. Still have some hard things to say about it too. They forget one really important thing in that movie. It's what a somm really does. It's about food and wine. There's no mention really about food in that whole movie, and that's really what a sommelier does. A wine expert can spot things blind all the time, but really the masterfulness of a great sommelier is knowing food and wine together. I know more about food than I probably do about wine. I know quite a bit about wine, and it's a fun thing. When I work with these kinds of wines that we're going to be tasting here today, my mind starts expanding into what can I pair that with? How many things can we do? What is it comparable to as far as these flavor profiles go? And how great these wines are. They will change in your glass. That's why, taking a sip now, get that first instinct. So just on your table right in front of you, your first white is the Roussan, and that's by Zaca Mesa. That's 2011. We'll talk about Roussan and the Rhone varieties quite a bit with Bob and with Eric, that's for sure. Your number 2 wine is the Morgen Climat, and that is the 2008 Chardonnay, and that is from the historic Sanford and Benedict vineyard. And we will definitely go into more detail on that vineyard. And, it's kind of interesting because Zaca Mesa, when it first started, it was kind of a test zone. They just, those original vines that were planted, they had everything in there. They had Cab and Merlot and Riesling and Pinot Noir and things like Pinot Noir. If you guys know, it doesn't do well in hot conditions. It's just that's not what it's for. The skins are so thin that just too much heat doesn't work. Up where I'm from, Napa, Sonoma, Napa's known for Cab because that's all they can really grow there. They can't grow Pinot there because it's too hot. Whereas Sonoma County, which is near the coast, of course that's where you can grow it. Down here, we have very special kinds of wind zones here, and that make this area in Santa Barbara County so special. Not only on the West Coast, but in the world. We're talking about these appellations are designed from east to west. And that is a very different kind of appellation than we have in Sonoma County. We're going more north to south. And so the reason for that is how the wind blows in through these gaps here, especially right where we're at right here, Santa Ynez. This is Santa Ynez Valley. When the actual appellation was made in 1983, it was a big appellation. It actually is 30 miles long. It starts out at Lompoc and goes all the way to the mountains this way. And basically, about every mile you go, you're going up 1 degree in temperature. And so we're going this way, whereas out there, towards the coast, near Lompoc and this area of Buellton to Lompoc, that's Pinot and Chardonnay zone. That is the ultimate kind of place for it. And we'll find out a little bit more about that from Ken and Jim for sure. But as we go from here going this way, now we're getting Mediterranean all of a sudden. And we're growing grapes here that are very different. There's about 60 different varieties that are grown in Santa Barbara County. It's fascinating what you can do here. But as we go this way, now we're starting to get into Sauvignon Blanc. And we're going to Happy Canyon, which is interesting because it's warm there. You're growing like world-class Cabernet Sauvignon. You're growing Merlots that are very heavy Merlots, not wimpy Merlots. You're starting to grow, Italian varieties and Spanish varieties as we start going this way. So we're talking about that east-west thing really does make a big impact. And we already knew that from Santa Maria Valley in general, because that's a really special place. I mean, that wind is coming right through Santa Maria, the town, and going straight in there. It's why it's not only for grapes, it's also one of the great agriculture areas of the West Coast. It really is. And going back to UC Davis' story, is back in the 70s there, what UC Davis was doing was trying to find, and Fresno State for that matter too, is find these zones where can you grow other fruit trees and produce are probably the places where we should be thinking about putting in some grapes. And that's where this expansion happened. And because of that, this great article that came out, we got to have a lot of great winemakers learn together. And it was a very different thing. People really taught each other, and it was a learning curve, like taking weird chances with these grapes that were being planted there at the Zaca Mesa property. No one knew what the potential was. Took years to really find out where the sweet spots of this whole entire county really are. And I think we're getting there. I mean, I think that all of us on this panel really feel strong about this area. And I think that it's just a great joy to have this great panel with me today. And so without further ado, because I could just go on and on about how cool this area is, I want to hand this over to Ken. A little quick story just about Ken. Is just, he was the first winemaker at Zaca Mesa.